He had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. After a long month of work, meetings that seemed endless and nights that felt too short, finally stepping into his backyard felt like stepping into a little slice of peace. The air smelled different here, fresher somehow, like the backyard itself was greeting him. His small but well-kept pool sparkled under the sun, and he could hear the faint buzz of a nearby lawnmower somewhere down the street. It was quiet but not empty, just the kind of quiet that made him feel at home. He had been away for 3 days, visiting a distant cousin in another city. It was meant to be a break, a pause from the constant routine, but even in his brief escape he had thought about the pool at home. He had envisioned coming back, diving into the cool water, and letting the sun warm his shoulders while the water washed away any leftover stress. He imagined himself floating for hours, the gentle ripples moving around him, every little worry dissolving. As he walked down the small path leading to the pool, something immediately felt off. It was subtle at first, like a note held slightly out of tune in a familiar song. The water wasn't as clear as it usually was. There was a faint haze floating just under the surface. Normally, he prided himself on keeping the pool pristine. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about the calm it brought him, the little sanctuary he had built in his backyard. And yet, now it looked different, like someone had stirred things around while he was gone. He paused at the edge and squinted. At first he thought maybe the sunlight was playing tricks on him. But as he moved closer, leaning slightly to see more clearly, he realized that the pool's filter system was running. That was odd. He never left it running when he was away unless he had set a timer, and he didn't remember doing so this time. More importantly, he knew he hadn't used it himself yet after coming home. A flicker of unease ran through him. He stepped back and looked around. The backyard was empty, no one in sight. But that didn't mean much. It wasn't the first time he had walked into the backyard only to realize that someone had been there without his knowledge. The thought made his stomach tighten a little. He shook it off at first, trying to convince himself that maybe it was nothing. Maybe the wind had moved something. Maybe some neighborhood maintenance worker had checked the pool for some reason, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He remembered the notes he had taken before leaving, making sure the neighbor he occasionally shared small conversations with wouldn't touch anything. He had trusted that the rules of common courtesy would be enough. But now, as he stared at the rippling water, doubt crept in like a shadow. Something told him that this wasn't just a simple mistake. He decided to investigate further. He walked slowly around the pool, paying attention to details he had never really noticed before. The lounge chairs were exactly where he had left them, the towels folded neatly on the racks, the small floating thermometer in its usual spot. Everything seemed normal, but there was something in the water that betrayed the truth. The water had small ripples, tiny bubbles that shouldn't be there. It didn't make sense unless someone had been in the pool recently. The realization hit him like a cold splash. Someone had used the pool while he was away. His first thought was disbelief. Who would do that? The thought of a stranger, or even someone he knew well enough to see regularly entering his personal space without permission, made his chest tighten. It wasn't just the pool, it was the principle of it. The backyard was his little world, and the idea that someone had breached it while he was gone felt like a violation. He looked around again, trying to piece together any clues. There were no footprints on the patio, no towels left behind, no bags, no sign that anyone had lingered long. It was as if the person had slipped in and out silently. That thought didn't calm him. It made him more anxious. The idea that someone had moved through his space, enjoying his pool without a word, was infuriating. He sank onto one of the lounge chairs, letting out a slow breath. He tried to focus on the facts. The water looked like it had been recently disturbed. The filter was running. The day he had left the pool was clear and calm. Everything pointed to one conclusion. The pool had been used while he was gone. His mind raced. It wasn't about confrontation yet. He wasn't even sure who had done it. But the idea that someone had ignored his space, walked right into it, and taken what wasn't theirs without a second thought, made him feel a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone think this was acceptable? Did they even consider how he would feel returning home to find his sanctuary tampered with? He tried to calm himself. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the neighbor thought it was okay. Or maybe someone had asked another neighbor and been given permission by mistake. He wanted to give the benefit of the doubt, but as he looked at the water, it didn't feel like a small mistake. It felt deliberate. The gentle ripples seemed like a message, a silent intrusion that said, "I was here and I didn't care." The frustration built slowly, a quiet storm inside him. He thought about the little things he had done to maintain the pool, checking the pH, balancing the chlorine, ensuring the water stayed crystal clear. This pool wasn't just a body of water. It was a project, a routine that brought him peace, a place where he could escape the world for a little while. The idea that someone had treated it casually, without care, felt personal. He stood up and ran a hand over the water, watching the ripples expand under his fingers. It was cold, crisp, and clear enough to swim, but not perfect. There was a faint scent in the air, a mix of chemicals that usually didn't linger when he kept the balance just right. The evidence was small, but it was there. Someone had been in the pool, and now he had to decide what to do about it. Part of him wanted to let it go, to ignore the incident and move on. But another part of him burned with a quiet intensity. He couldn't just ignore it. Not when it felt like someone had stepped over an invisible line he had drawn for his own space. He thought about confronting the neighbor directly, asking politely if they had used the pool. But the thought of the conversation made his stomach churn. Would they deny it? Would they make excuses? As he sat back down on the lounge chair, he thought about his next steps. He needed to be calm, he told himself. Acting out of anger rarely solved anything. But he also needed to set boundaries, to make it clear that his pool and his backyard were private. He couldn't let someone else's carelessness turn his sanctuary into something he felt invaded in. He looked out over the pool again, watching the sun glint off the small ripples. The moment was quiet, almost peaceful, but under it simmered the sense of violation. He wondered if the neighbor realized how personal this pool was to him. To others, it might just be water and tiles, a backyard amenity. But to him, it was a place of comfort, of reflection, of escape. And now someone had used it without permission. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. He cleaned the edges of the pool, ran tests on the water, and fixed minor adjustments to the filter. Every action was careful, deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if maintaining the pool properly could restore his sense of control. But control was tricky. The fact remained that someone had breached his space, and no amount of cleaning could erase that reality. By the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the backyard, he still hadn't made a decision. Should he confront the neighbor? Should he report the incident to the homeowners association? Or should he try a subtler approach, something that would send a message without starting a confrontation? The questions circled in his mind, a quiet, constant hum that refused to settle. Finally, as the evening air grew cooler and the backyard lights flickered on, he sat back in the chair, staring at the pool. He realized that this was more than just water that had been disturbed. It was a test of patience, of boundaries, of respect, and he wasn't sure yet how he would respond. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't just ignore it. Something had to be done. The pool shimmered under the soft glow of the lights, calm and deceptively innocent, but in its depths, he saw the evidence of the intrusion, the reminder that even small personal spaces could be violated. He took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs, and promised himself that he would handle this carefully. Not recklessly, not out of spite, but in a way that respected his own boundaries and sent a clear message. That night, he lay in bed thinking about the pool, replaying every detail in his mind. The quiet ripples, the faint smell, the running filter, each one a clue, a sign of something that had happened in his absence. He didn't know exactly how to respond yet, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The weekend ahead would be quiet, but it would also be a time of planning, of deciding how to reclaim the peace that had been disrupted. And as he drifted off to sleep, the image of the pool lingered in his mind, not just as a body of water, but as a symbol of personal space, of trust, and of the small, delicate boundaries that keep life orderly. Something had crossed those boundaries, and soon he would have to decide what to do about it. The morning after he discovered the pool had been used, he woke up with the memory fresh in his mind. The sun was just starting to filter through the blinds, casting thin streaks of light across his bedroom floor. He lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what had happened. He could still see the ripples in the water, feel the faint disturbance of someone else's presence lingering in the backyard. The thought made him restless. He couldn't just let it go. The pool was his private space, and he needed a way to make sure it stayed that way. He got up and walked to the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. The warmth of the mug in his hands helped calm him slightly, but it didn't ease the irritation that had settled in. He tried to think logically, to weigh his options. Confronting the neighbor directly felt messy. There was always a chance it would turn into an argument, something that would upset the quiet balance of the neighborhood. But ignoring it completely also didn't sit right. It felt like giving permission for someone to treat his space carelessly. He decided to take a moment to plan carefully. He wasn't looking for revenge in a cruel sense, but he wanted to make a point. He wanted the neighbor to understand that using someone else's property without permission was not acceptable, but it had to be harmless. It had to send a message without causing real damage or breaking any rules. He thought about all the ways he could handle it, pacing slowly across the kitchen floor, scribbling notes on a small notepad. One idea came, to him almost like a spark, something that would make the water temporarily unpleasant or surprising without causing harm. He didn't want to hurt the neighbor, but he wanted them to feel a little shock, a little discomfort, so that the lesson would stick. He started researching online, looking for suggestions about safe chemicals, harmless substances, anything that could serve as a gentle warning. The more he read, the more he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't acting out of malice, he was setting a boundary, defending his space. Hours passed as he carefully considered his options. He ruled out anything that could permanently stain or damage the pool. He ruled out anything toxic. He even read forums where people shared experiences about unexpected visitors in pools and how to handle them. Every story he read made him more determined to act, but also more cautious. He didn't want this to spiral out of control. It had to be precise, controlled, and above all safe. By late afternoon, he thought he had a plan. There was a particular fluid, a harmless chemical used to temporarily change the water's appearance and feel. It wouldn't hurt anyone, wouldn't damage the pool, and would wear off after a short while. Perfect. He could create a small surprise, something that would make it clear the pool was not to be used without permission. The idea made him feel a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Even though it was harmless, the act itself felt like stepping over a line he had always tried not to cross. Before taking action, he made sure to prepare everything carefully. He checked the pool's chemical levels, ensuring it was safe for the addition of the fluid. He set up a small plan for observing the neighbor's reaction without being noticed. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted the lesson to speak for itself. His movements were careful, deliberate, almost ritualistic. It was strange to feel this level of calculation for something that seemed so small. But the violation he had felt yesterday made it feel necessary. While preparing, he reflected on why this mattered so much. It wasn't just about the pool. It was about respect, about personal space, about the invisible rules that made life in a neighborhood bearable. When someone ignored those rules, even in small ways, it unsettled the balance. He thought about all the times he had knocked on a neighbor's door before using shared amenities, always polite, always asking. The thought that someone hadn't extended the same courtesy burned quietly inside him. Even as he planned, he tried to anticipate the possible outcomes. He imagined the neighbor noticing the unusual water, perhaps pausing in confusion, maybe even calling over someone else in the neighborhood. He thought about the neighbor's reaction, wondering whether they would laugh, feel embarrassed, or take it as a serious warning. His goal wasn't to humiliate, but to communicate. Still, the uncertainty made his stomach twist in a way that was both thrilling and nerve-wracking. That evening, as the sun started to lower, he finally put his plan into motion. He poured the bore fluid into the pool carefully, watching the surface ripple and change in subtle ways. The effect wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. A small, strange difference that would be obvious to anyone entering the pool. He stepped back, watching from a safe distance behind a bush near the fence. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the anticipation of the moment he had orchestrated. He stayed hidden for a while, observing the backyard, imagining the neighbor approaching. He checked the time repeatedly, wondering when the neighbor would notice. It wasn't long before the faint rustle of movement reached his ears. The neighbor came into view, walking toward the pool with casual curiosity. They paused at the edge, looking down at the water. The expression on their face changed almost instantly, from casual indifference to puzzled confusion. The neighbor stepped back, peering closer at the water, trying to understand what was different. He could see their brows furrow, their head tilt slightly, the small tentative movements of someone trying to make sense of an unexpected change. A part of him felt a surge of satisfaction. This wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about acknowledgement, about making sure the boundaries he valued were respected. The neighbor had learned a small lesson, one that was safe but unmistakable. Still, as he watched, he realized something important. Even harmless actions had consequences. The neighbor looked around, scanning the area, probably wondering what had happened or who had done it. There was no anger visible yet, just confusion. But that confusion could easily turn into suspicion or confrontation. The realization made him pause. He had intended a subtle lesson, not a conflict, but the line between them was thin. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Observation was enough for now. He didn't need to escalate anything further. The neighbor lingered at the edge of the pool for a few minutes, poking the water gently with a foot, watching the unusual ripples form. Finally, seemingly satisfied with their own understanding, the neighbor turned and walked away. There was no confrontation, no angry words, just the quiet realization that something was different. The protagonist felt a wave of relief. The lesson had been delivered, the point made, and no one had been harmed. Still, he remained cautious. He knew the neighbor would probably talk to someone else, maybe ask about what had happened. He couldn't control the conversation, but he could control his own actions. That was all he needed for now. The boundaries were clear, and he felt a small sense of vindication. As night fell, he cleaned up, making sure the pool's edges were tidy, the filter still running smoothly. He reflected on the day, thinking about how easy it had been for anger or frustration to push someone into rash decisions. He had managed to act without cruelty, without causing real damage, and yet still make a point. It was a delicate balance, and he felt quietly proud of maintaining it. He sat in one of the lounge chairs, watching the stars begin to appear above the backyard. The air was calm now, carrying a soft breeze that ruffled the leaves of the nearby trees. He thought about the nature of boundaries, about how people sometimes tested them without realizing the impact. This small incident had reminded him of the importance of protecting his personal space, of asserting his needs without crossing into aggression. The next morning he woke up early, checking the pool again. The water had returned to its normal state. The unusual effects of the fluid dissipated entirely. Everything was as it had been before. The pool was safe, calm, and undisturbed. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the lesson had been temporary, effective, and harmless. It reminded him that there were ways to assert himself without creating lasting harm. Throughout the day, he reflected on the events. He thought about the neighbor, wondering if they had pieced together what had happened. Would they understand the message? Would it prevent future intrusions? He didn't know for sure, but the act itself had given him a sense of control and agency that he had been missing the day he returned home to find the pool used. By evening, he had decided on a few preventative steps to avoid future incidents. He would install a small sign reminding neighbors not to use the pool without permission. He would also consider a lock or a subtle barrier to ensure the space remained private. These measures weren't about hostility. They were about clear communication. They were about protecting his sanctuary while maintaining peace in the neighborhood. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, he sat by the pool, enjoying the calm he had fought to maintain. The water sparkled under the fading light, serene once more. The events of the last 2 days had taught him a quiet lesson about boundaries, about measured responses, and about the importance of defending one's personal space thoughtfully. He leaned back, letting the soft evening breeze brush against his skin. There was still a small tension, a lingering awareness that boundaries had been tested, but he felt ready for whatever came next. The pool, now calm and untouched, reflected more. The morning after he had poured the harmless fluid into the pool, he woke up to a quiet neighborhood. The sun was bright and birds chirped lazily in the trees. He made his way to the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and glanced out the window toward the backyard. The pool looked calm and inviting again, the water clear and still, just as it had always been. For a moment he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the lesson had been delivered without causing harm. But as the day moved on, he couldn't shake a feeling of anticipation. He knew the neighbor would eventually notice something unusual had happened, and he wondered how they would react. Would they be confused? Embarrassed? Angry? He tried to distract himself by tidying the house and catching up on emails, but his mind kept drifting back to the backyard. The pool had become more than just water. It was now a symbol of boundaries and respect, and he found himself checking it more than usual. Around midday, he noticed movement outside. The neighbor appeared at the edge of the property, peering toward the pool. At first, they didn't seem to see him, and he stayed out of sight behind the blinds. The neighbor's steps were slow, cautious, and there was a distinct look of curiosity mixed with confusion on their face. They walked around the perimeter, hands on hips, glancing back and forth as if trying to understand what had changed. He watched silently, noticing every small gesture, the tilt of the head, the squint of the eyes, the brief pause as if trying to remember something. The neighbor leaned over the pool, eyes scanning the water, a finger tracing the surface, testing for something unusual. It was subtle, but it told him that the message had been noticed. His heart beat a little faster, a mix of relief and anxiety swirling inside. The lesson had been delivered, but now the real test began. How would the neighbor respond? For a while, the neighbor seemed frozen in place, unsure what to do next. Then, as if deciding to investigate further, they went inside their house only to reappear minutes later with a towel and a small net, seemingly inspecting the pool from a distance. He watched them carefully, noting the way they approached the water cautiously, almost hesitantly. There was no anger yet, no shouting or accusations, only a careful, deliberate attempt to understand. He wondered what the neighbor was thinking. Did they suspect him? Did they think it was a prank by someone else? The possibilities ran through his mind endlessly. He didn't want a confrontation, but he knew curiosity could easily turn into suspicion, and suspicion could easily turn into anger. He felt a flicker of unease. This was harmless, yes, but even harmless actions could spiral if misinterpreted. He decided to remain patient. There was nothing to gain from revealing himself too soon. He stayed hidden, observing every movement, every change in expression. The neighbor's brows furrowed slightly as they leaned closer to the water, eyes narrowing as if trying to spot any clues. Then, almost as if giving up, they stepped back and crossed their arms, standing by the pool for several minutes, silently contemplating. During this time, he thought about the neighbor as a person, not just as someone who had intruded on his property. He imagined their confusion, their possible frustration, and even their embarrassment. He realized that while he wanted to assert boundaries, he also didn't want to create lasting conflict. The goal was clarity, not confrontation. He reminded himself of this, letting the thought calm the small twinge of anxiety in his chest. After a while, the neighbor left the immediate area, walking slowly back toward their own backyard. He watched as they paused occasionally, glancing over their shoulder at the pool as if the water itself held questions that only they could answer. The suspense was tangible. For a few minutes, the street seemed almost too quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Then, unexpectedly, a small interaction occurred. Another neighbor, who lived a few houses down, walked by and waved. The neighbor at the pool responded, smiling faintly, and began a brief conversation. He could hear fragments of words. Strange water. Not sure what happened. Maybe it's safe. Though he stayed hidden, careful not to interrupt or reveal himself. The conversation lasted only a minute, but it was enough to confirm that the neighbor had noticed the change and was thinking about it. He felt a mix of satisfaction and nervousness. The message was out there, subtle but clear. It wasn't a confrontation, but it was enough to make the point. He realized that even small actions could have a profound effect, that boundaries didn't always need to be enforced through words alone. Sometimes a simple, harmless signal could communicate more than a conversation ever could. Still, he knew this was only part of the story. The neighbor could still react later, could still confront him directly or indirectly. He had to be prepared for that eventuality. He thought about how he would respond if the neighbor came over to ask questions. He planned his words carefully in his mind, imagining a calm, measured tone explaining that the pool was private without admitting too much. He wanted to assert his boundaries without escalating the situation unnecessarily. As the afternoon passed, he noticed the neighbor lingering near the fence more than once, glancing over at the pool. There was a subtle tension in the air, a quiet negotiation between two people trying to understand one another without words. He could feel the energy, the small vibrations of curiosity, uncertainty, and respect intertwining. It was almost fascinating to watch the way humans could communicate silently, through actions rather than speech. He reminded himself to stay calm. The fluid had been harmless, temporary, and effective. The neighbor had noticed, and the message was clear. Now patience was key. He watched as the neighbor eventually moved on, heading inside their house only to reappear briefly to check their own backyard. There was no aggression, no anger, only a careful assessment, a quiet reflection on what had happened. During this time, he reflected on his own emotions. The initial anger and frustration had shifted into something more complex, a mix of vigilance, satisfaction, and cautious anticipation. He understood that boundaries were delicate and that enforcing them required thoughtfulness, not impulsiveness. He also realized that even minor breaches of trust could stir deep feelings that needed to be managed carefully to prevent escalation. He decided to document everything, just in case. He took notes about the timing of the neighbors' reactions, their movements, and any interactions with others. Not as evidence for punishment, but as a way to understand human behavior, to see how small actions could ripple through relationships. He found a strange satisfaction in observing these details, noting how curiosity, confusion, and respect intertwined in subtle ways. By evening, the neighbor had seemed to accept, at least temporarily, the unusual state of the pool. They didn't confront him, didn't yell or accuse. They simply adjusted their expectations, treating the water as something out of the ordinary but not worth immediate concern. He felt a small relief wash over him, knowing that the situation hadn't escalated beyond his control. That night, he cleaned up the backyard, checking the pool one more time to ensure everything was safe and normal. The water had returned to its usual clarity, the effect of the fluid having worn off completely. He reflected on the day, thinking about how the neighbor had handled the unexpected change. There had been no hostility, only observation, contemplation, and subtle understanding. The lesson had been delivered without harm, without confrontation, and in a way that maintained a fragile peace. As he sat in the lounge chair, watching the stars appear one by one, he thought about human nature. Boundaries were invisible lines, often unspoken, yet essential for coexistence. When someone crossed them, intentionally or not, it could create ripples that reached far beyond the immediate moment. But carefully managed actions, like his small intervention, could restore order without conflict. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing he had walked that line successfully. He also considered the neighbor's perspective. Perhaps they hadn't realized the pool was so personal to him. Perhaps it had seemed like an open amenity, something to use casually. He thought about the importance of communication, of setting expectations clearly, and of defending one's space thoughtfully. The incident had taught him more than just vigilance. It had shown him the subtle dynamics of respect, curiosity, and understanding that existed between neighbors. The next morning, he woke up with a renewed sense of calm. He checked the pool again, and everything looked perfect. The water was inviting, clear, and undisturbed. The neighborhood seemed quiet and ordinary, as if nothing unusual had happened. But he knew better. Something had changed, even if subtly. The boundaries had been reinforced, the message delivered, and the delicate balance of respect restored. As he went about his day, he noticed small things. The neighbor glancing occasionally at the pool from inside their yard, the faint curiosity in their movements, the unspoken acknowledgement of the pool as a private space. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The lesson had worked. Not through confrontation or anger, but through observation, careful action, and patience. By evening, he felt a sense of closure for the first time since returning from his trip. The pool was calm, his space was respected, and he had acted without causing harm. He realized that sometimes indirect communication, when handled thoughtfully, could be more power. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different, though nothing had outwardly changed. The streets were the same, the trees swayed in the light breeze, and children played in yards as usual. Yet for him, the atmosphere had shifted. The pool was calm, the water inviting, and yet there was a quiet tension lingering like an invisible thread connecting him to the neighbor. He had sent a message, harmless but unmistakable, and now the consequences were beginning to unfold. He started the day with his usual routine, checking the pool, adjusting minor chemical levels, and making sure everything was in order. The water was clear, the surface still, and nothing seemed out of place. Yet his mind kept returning to the neighbor. How were they processing what had happened? Did they feel confused, embarrassed, or cautious? He couldn't know for sure, but he felt a growing awareness that even small actions could ripple far beyond their immediate effects. Around mid-morning, he noticed the neighbor outside doing yard work near the fence. Their movements were deliberate, careful, almost cautious. It was subtle, but he could sense a quiet vigilance in the way they glanced toward the pool. For a moment he wondered if they were trying to communicate silently, acknowledging the boundaries without words. It was a strange sensation, seeing respect expressed through hesitation, through the careful measurement of steps and glances. He continued to observe discreetly from inside his house. The neighbors seemed more alert than usual, pausing at times to look toward the backyard, then shaking their head or walking away. The energy between the two households had shifted from casual coexistence to a more careful awareness. It was subtle but real. He realized that the harmless act had not only conveyed a message but had also altered behavior, instilling a quiet respect that hadn't existed before. By afternoon, he decided to step outside and engage in normal routines, mowing the lawn, arranging the garden chairs, and checking the pool's filter. The neighbor occasionally glanced over, a small smile appearing briefly before they returned to their work. There was no confrontation, no words exchanged, only a mutual recognition of boundaries and caution. The calm yet alert energy between them was almost palpable, a silent negotiation that had emerged from the previous day's events. While performing these tasks, he reflected on the broader implications. He realized that boundaries were delicate and often unspoken, and that when they were tested, people had to respond thoughtfully. Acting impulsively could escalate situations, but measured, harmless actions could convey messages effectively. The experience had taught him patience and strategy, and he felt a quiet pride in having maintained control without causing harm. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the backyard, he noticed the neighbor pausing near the fence again. This time, they lingered a little longer, seemingly observing not just the pool but his entire routine. He sensed a mixture of curiosity, caution, and respect. It was almost as if the neighbor was recalibrating their understanding of boundaries, learning the limits without needing words. The thought brought a small sense of relief. The lesson had worked and peace was restored, albeit with a newfound awareness on both sides. Later in the evening, he walked along the street briefly, greeting other neighbors casually. Conversations flowed normally, but he couldn't help noticing subtle changes in interactions. People seemed more aware, more careful in their movements and words. The previous incident had created a ripple effect, a quiet lesson about respect and boundaries that extended beyond just him and the immediate neighbor. It was a reminder that even minor actions could influence relationships and community dynamics in unexpected ways. Back at home, he sat by the pool as night approached, reflecting on everything that had occurred. The water shimmered under the soft glow of the garden lights, calm and undisturbed. He thought about the neighbor's reaction, the subtle adjustments in behavior, and the absence of confrontation. It was a confirmation that the approach he had chosen, measured, harmless, and strategic, was effective. The lesson had been delivered without escalation, without anger, and without permanent consequences. He also reflected on his own behavior and emotions. Initially, anger and frustration had driven his thoughts, but careful planning and patience had transformed those emotions into purposeful action. He realized that responding thoughtfully, rather than impulsively, could turn a potentially tense situation into an opportunity for learning and reflection. This understanding gave him a sense of calm confidence, reinforcing the value of patience and measured responses in everyday life. The next day, the neighborhood felt calmer still. The neighbor's actions were careful but relaxed, a subtle acknowledgement that boundaries were respected. There was no hostility, no resentment, only a quiet recognition of the rules that governed shared spaces. He noticed small signs of consideration, a glance before stepping near the pool, a polite nod when passing by. These minor gestures reflected the success of his strategy. Respect could be established without confrontation, and lessons could be communicated subtly and effectively. As he went about his daily routine, he also thought about future measures to prevent similar incidents. While the fluid had served its purpose, it was temporary. He considered installing subtle reminders near the pool or adjusting access in ways that were non-confrontational but effective. The goal wasn't to punish but to maintain boundaries and prevent misunderstandings. It was a proactive approach, ensuring that respect would continue without tension or resentment. Over the following days, interactions with the neighbor remained polite, careful, but friendly. There was no direct mention of the incident, but an unspoken understanding had formed. Both households operated with awareness and respect, a delicate balance that allowed coexistence without conflict. He observed the neighbor's behavior with interest, noting the subtle shifts in routine and attitude. It was a quiet reminder that even minor actions could shape relationships in meaningful ways. He also spent time reflecting on personal growth. The incident had challenged him to navigate emotions, assert boundaries, and respond thoughtfully. It had been a lesson in patience, strategy, and human behavior. He realized that conflicts didn't always need to be confrontational to be resolved. Sometimes subtle actions, careful planning, and patience could communicate more effectively than words or anger. The experience strengthened his confidence in handling delicate situations thoughtfully and respectfully. By the end of the week, the pool remained calm, the water clear and inviting. The neighbors' visits to the fence were infrequent and casual, a subtle acknowledgement that the message had been received. The balance of respect had been restored, and both households settled into a rhythm that was cautious but peaceful. The tension that had existed initially had transformed into a quiet, mutual understanding. Sitting by the pool one evening, he thought about the broader lessons from the situation. Boundaries were not just physical, they were emotional and social. Respecting them required awareness, thoughtfulness, and sometimes subtle action. Violations could create tension, but measured, harmless responses could restore balance and prevent escalation. He felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that he had maintained his principles while avoiding conflict. The next morning, he decided to formalize a few small precautions. He placed a subtle sign near the pool, a friendly reminder that the area was private. He also checked the pool's cover and lock mechanisms, ensuring that access remained controlled without creating hostility. These measures were practical, preventive, and communicated respect for personal space. They reinforced the lesson without relying on confrontation or anger. Throughout the following days, he observed the neighborhood dynamics with interest. He noticed the neighbor occasionally pausing near the fence, glancing toward the pool, but always with respect and caution. Their interactions were polite, measured, and friendly. It was a quiet affirmation that boundaries had been re-established and that both parties had adapted to a new understanding. The neighborhood felt more harmonious with an invisible layer of awareness woven into everyday interactions. He also reflected on his own sense of peace. Initially, anger and frustration had dominated his thoughts, but careful planning, patience, and harmless action had transformed the situation into a positive outcome. He had communicated boundaries effectively, maintained personal integrity, and prevented conflict. It was a subtle victory, but a meaningful one. The pool, calm and pristine, was not just a physical space. It represented control, respect, and thoughtful action. By evening, he felt a renewed sense of balance. The air was calm, the water reflected the glow of garden lights, and the neighborhood was quiet. The incident with the neighbor had become a lesson, not just for them, but for him as well. He had learned about patience, the power of subtle communication, and the importance of maintaining boundaries with care. It was a quiet understanding that respect could be taught without anger, and that small, harmless actions could have a lasting impact. As night fell, he sat back, letting the gentle breeze brush against his skin, the stars reflected in the pool calm and undisturbed. He thought about the week that had passed, the discovery, the planning, the observation, and the subtle consequences. Every step had been deliberate, every action considered. He felt satisfaction in knowing